Nearly half a century after the Arab-Israeli conflict began, a hotel in Barcelona was about to become the venue for an extraordinary encounter. Yasser Arafat, leader of the Palestinian people for over 30 years, was coming to meet a man who had once tried to assassinate him. Ehud Barak, a former commando, now aspired to become prime minister on a promise of bringing peace.
שם אותי באיזה חדר ענק בארמון, עמד שם איזה פסנתר כנף, אז אמרתי לשומרים, תשמרו עליו עד שאם ערפאת יבוא, אני אנגן קצת, ניגנתי קצת. הוא בא, סגרתי מהר את הפסנתר ובאתי. והגיע ערפאת באמת במדים, אחר החזיק את היד ואמר, חיכיתי כל כך הרבה זמן לראות אותך, שמעתי כל כך הרבה. גם אני עקבתי אחריך כל כך הרבה בזה. יותר מאוחר בלילה ישבתי איתו בסוויטה שלו במשך 3 שעות אולי ב4 עיניים.
Arafat began assertively.
You know that we are now, in this century, the only people who are under occupation? Who can accept this?
אני אמרתי לו אז שגם מלחמות בין עמים קשורות בהרבה דברים שהם כואבים מאוד, והאחריות עלינו זה לראות אם אפשר להביא את זה לפתרון.
Now we are cousins and partners and going in the same line for the peace of the waves, not only
Barak seemed less certain. Their determination to find peace would soon be put to the test by an American president.
If we solve the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, we could clearly make a larger peace in the Middle East. The Syrians would make peace with Israel. Israel's Arab neighbors would then have normal relationships with them. And together they could build a whole new Middle East.
This program is made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Ehud Barak, elected prime minister on his pledge to bring peace with Israel's Arab neighbors, promptly paid a visit to Washington.
We were talking, Ehud would get excited and move his hands around a lot, and I'd get excited and chomp down on my cigar.
זה הכל היה דו-שיח בינינו על מה נכון, באיזה אסטרטגיה נכון לגשת עליהן מול יריבים שאתה לא יכול לצפות מראש.
Barak's strategy was to start seeking peace not with the Palestinians, but with Israel's neighbor, Syria.
אמרתי לו לגבי סוריה, שבסופו של דבר, בבסיסו העניין הוא יותר פשוט, משום שאין שם ארץ אבות, אין שם את בית המקדש, אמנם הייתה שם פעם אחת בהיסטוריה התיישבות יהודית, אבל נשארו רק כמה בתי כנסת, גם חלק מהם עדיין בצד הסורי של רמת הגולן.
But in Syria, the aging ruler, President Hafez al-Assad, would never dream of receiving an Israeli. So Clinton sent his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, to Damascus. Her welcome from the foreign minister was friendly but firm. No peace talks until Israel withdraws from occupied Syrian land.
So we said to them, the full withdrawal means the withdrawal to the 4th of June 1967 lines. In other words, where the Syrians were 1 day before the war started on the 5th of June 1967.
In the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel had captured the Golan Heights above the lake the Bible calls the Sea of Galilee. In demanding it back, President Assad was known to be intransigent. Secretary Albright faced a challenge.
He is in this incredible palace that looks like something out of James Bond. And we sat and talked. I said that we wanted very much to get these talks going. And he said yes. And we were very surprised, frankly. And in fact, I wanted to make sure that I'd really heard it right, because, you know, everything is done through interpreters.
President Assad said to Secretary Albright, I trust President Clinton, I trust you want to conclude a peace settlement, and so would I.
I then said, when could we begin? And he said, right away. And then I said, well, who are you going to send? And he said, I'll send my foreign minister.
Within a week, the Syrian foreign minister and his team arrived at the White House to meet their Israeli enemy on neutral ground.
We said to the Americans, the Golan Heights are Syrian territory, should come back to Syria. Negotiations would not be on whether the Syrians would get back all the Golan Heights or not. The negotiations will be focusing on the other components of peace, the other elements of peace.
The Americans assumed that Barak, pushing for peace with Syria, was willing to meet their principal demand. When the Israeli plane landed in Washington, the whole delegation stepped down from the plane, except one.
We waited, and then somebody came down and said, the Prime Minister wants to see you. So I went up the stairs into the plane. I said, you know, Mr. Prime Minister, everybody's waiting for you. And he said, he looked at me and he said, I can't do it. I cannot enter the negotiations and give up all of my cards in the first instance. And that will leak in Israel, and I will be seen as a sucker. And my polls indicate that they won't support the deal.
את הדבר הזה, את התביעה של אסד, לקבל את תנאיו לפני הסכם כתנאי לפתיחתו, אי אפשר לקבל משום שהפירוש הוא שלא יהיה הסכם. לא משום שההסכם לא יהיה טוב. לא יהיה הסכם.
Barak composed himself for the cameras, and they went through the ritual greeting as though nothing had happened.
The Prime Minister of Israel and the Foreign Minister of Syria.
The Prime Minister would not make concessions so early, so the first round of talks got nowhere.
It was obvious from the beginning that the Israeli delegation didn't want the peace talks to move even an inch ahead.
After the Christmas holiday, the talks reconvened in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Relations between the two Middle Eastern teams were as chilly as the weather.
When we entered the room, I kept my hand like this because I couldn't tell who's an Israeli and who's an American, and therefore I decided not to shake hands with anyone, just in case I shook hands with the wrong person and somebody took a photo.
Barak told Clinton he had to hold out for some land beside the Sea of Galilee, land which the Syrians said was non-negotiable.
Barak had a very good reason for wanting to maintain the strip of land around the Sea of Galilee, or Lake Tiberias. And that was that the lake provides about 30% of Israel's water supply.
אמרתי לקלינטון, עד שלא יהיה מגע עין ביניכם, ואתה, אם אתה תביא את כל המשקל של ארצות הברית, יכול להיות ששם תוכל לחוש אם יש נכונות אמת או אין נכונות אמת.
Clinton took a chance and agreed to invite the Syrian president to a neutral venue.
I called Assad and I told him that I was going to be in Europe. I'd like to come to Geneva and meet him, and that I thought I would have an offer from Barak that he would like.
And President Assad tried to know over the phone what President Clinton has. And he asked me as an interpreter to ask him precisely what he has.
I didn't myself know precisely how far we could get the Israelis to go.
President Clinton said he didn't want to talk over the phone.
President Assad arrived for what was billed as a historic summit. But President Clinton still had no idea how much land Barak insisted on keeping. With only an hour to go, Clinton was desperate.
And I called Barak and said, look, I've got to have something specific. if you have decided that you want to make a peace with Syria, which is what you told me, you can't send me out there barehanded.
אסד צריך להתרשם שישראל מוכנה לגמישויות, שזה לא מדובר פה על 100 מטר פה, 400 מטר שם. השמיים זה הגבול למה שאפשר לעשות, אם רוצים.
So Barak said try to sell it, and I said I'll try.
Anticipating a historic deal, both sides had brought a large team, but most were excluded from the crucial meeting. For the National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, this was unacceptable.
Sandy didn't want to miss it. I was supposed to take the notes, so both of us exited the room and then surreptitiously walked into the next door room, adjacent room, which was only separated by a piece of cloth, basically, so we could hear everything that was going on.
They had agreed that they would not cough or move or speak.
And President Clinton took some notes out and then put them up on the table.
Well, I fudged actually a little bit, trying to keep the meeting from blowing up. I opened the map, and I said that Barak was prepared to withdraw to a commonly agreed definition of the June 4th, 1967 border.
And of course, I translated that accurately to President Assad, which is in Arabic, Barak سوف ينسحب إلى حدود متفق عليها أو يتفق عليها. فقال لي الرئيس الأسد اسأليه ما هذا متفق عليها. President Assad said to me, ask him, what is this agreed upon border? What is this phrase? Let him say that again.
So the word commonly agreed border automatically told him that he is not the one who's going to say where June 4th, 67 line is.
And I'll never forget what he said. He said, it's our lake too. They don't trust us not to foul the lake or destroy the lake. I want to run my feet in that lake. I want to sit on the shore and have my feet in the lake. That is all I want.
President Assad just did this, and I was almost pushing him down because I felt, my God, we knew it might not work, but not so quickly.
And Sandy, who's sitting next to me in the adjacent room, takes a piece of paper and pen, and he writes, I'm afraid this is a historic meeting.
An historic failure, not an historic success.
And of course, that was the last time that President Assad saw President Clinton. Less than 3 months later, President Assad died.
Barak shrugged off the failure with Syria and turned to the even greater challenge of the Palestinians. Despite Barak's promises of peace, Yasser Arafat felt he was no nearer to his people's dream of a Palestinian state. And Barak had expanded settlements on Palestinian land around Jerusalem.
ואנחנו נמשיך לפתח ולחזק את מעלה אדומים.
To try to deliver on his mandate for peace, Barak sent his interior minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, deep into the occupied territories to make a pitch.
Ben-Ami came with one message from Barak. It's time for leaders to meet and make the historic decisions. The time is right, the time is ripe, the time is high, it's high time for a summit.
ערפאת לא עשה רושם שהוא מתרשם מכל הדברים האלה. אותו רק העסיק השאלה של ירושלים. ירושלים הייתה במרכז. אז הוא חזר ושאל, כמובן, מטבע הדברים, מה לגבי ירושלים?
East Jerusalem was where the Palestinians wanted the capital of their new state. It contained the old city with its holy site, sacred to both Muslims and Jews, its Haram al-Sharif, or noble sanctuary, to Muslims, and Temple Mount with its Wailing Wall to Jews. And since the 1967 war, it has all been occupied land, administered by Israel. Arafat now suggested they share. Rome had shown the way.
Jerusalem to be the capital of two states, as Rome is the capital of two states, the capital of His Holiness the Pope, and the capital of the Italian government.
President Arafat spoke so much about Jerusalem, and he wanted to give Shlomo Ben Ami the message that he knows Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the most important thing. So how can you take me or suggest taking me to a summit without opening this chapter in Jerusalem? It's not about borders, it's not about anything, it's about Jerusalem.
Nevertheless, President Clinton invited both sides to a summit. And Arafat could not turn down an invitation from the President of the United States.
I believe that even if the Palestinians didn't know what their positions were, so they weren't ready yet, it was time they got ready, and they would get ready in the context of a talk.
Clinton flew to Camp David to host the summit. His aim was peace in the Middle East and a viable Palestinian state, an end to half a century of war. It was a high ambition, even for Washington. En route to America, Barak was worried. He had gambled his political future on Arafat's proving a genuine partner in the peace process. The American ambassador to Israel was on Barak's plane.
Barak, when he was ready to have a talk with me, went back to his bedroom and called me in there. And I sat on the bed since there was nowhere else to sit.
והשתמשתי בדימוי של לוליין בטרפז, שבאים אחד מול השני, ושאני קופץ עם הטרפז, ואני הולך לעשות את הסלטה הזאת, ואני לא יודע אם השני יושיט הידיים או ייתן ליפול, ואין למטה רשת ביטחון. אני הייתי מודע לזה שמבחינה פוליטית, פנימית, אני לוקח סיכון גבוה מאוד.
Barak told Clinton his starting position. Jerusalem would never be shared. Arafat demanded half Jerusalem as his capital and Palestinian sovereignty over what he knew as the Haram, Barak's Temple Mount.
We pledged to each other we would answer no questions and offer no comments. So I have to set a good example. Thank you. Thank you.
The Americans had drafted an agreement to present to both sides, and now Clinton had 10 days to turn it into a deal. The Americans led the way, but one side had to be the first to follow them. From now on, the doors were closed to the press. The American draft went first to Barak and appeared to say the Israelis would have to share Jerusalem with the Palestinians.
כשברק שמע את זה, הוא קפץ כנשוך נחש. הדבר הזה לא היה מקובל עליו לחלוטין.
The Americans wrote in an amendment to take account of Israel's position and took the paper to Arafat's cabin.
So President Arafat asked me to open it and read what's written about Jerusalem. And he noticed that even in that part there were some handwriting.
And he said, how can I accept that? How can I accept that? This is an Israeli idea. How can I accept that?
He holds me and he said, the most important thing for me is Jerusalem, the Haram. He took the paper from my hand, threw it on the ground, started screaming, call President Clinton for me. I want to go see President Clinton. I said, Mr. President, I can't wake the United States President at 2:30 in the morning. I can't.
I'd gone to bed and I got a call from Gamal, and he said, Madam Secretary, you're not going to believe this, or maybe you will believe it because you know the Palestinians. They are in an uproar. They have to come and see you. And I said, you've got to be kidding. And he said, no. I said, what time is it? And he said, it's 2:30. Everybody's very apologetic.
I was so ashamed, to go to a lady's compound at 5 to 3 in the morning. I did not feel good at it.
And I thought, well, this is what I get paid for. So I got up and I got dressed and I received them in the living room part of my cabin.
But I explained to her that this paper we cannot accept. This was a mixture of hasty things. And this is not how peace is made. And she said, that's okay, that's your position. I'll tell the president.
For a week, every American effort was rejected by one side or the other. And Barak, who had asked for the summit meeting, now refused point blank to negotiate directly with Arafat. A frustrated President Clinton was no nearer his dream of making the peace, and he was due to leave for a G8 summit in Japan the next day. He confronted the Israeli Prime Minister.
I told him he had to make a better offer. He just had to. We had to move this thing off the dime, and that I was going to Okinawa, and we're going to shut the thing down. It would be a terrible thing to do. So then, when I finally put it on him, he said, well, I got to go talk to the team.
Barak called the whole dozen-strong Israeli team together.
אמרתי להם, אנחנו ניצבים בפני החלטה מהגורליות בתולדות המדינה. דומה אולי להחלטה של בן גוריון על קבלת תוכנית החלוקה, או להחלטה של מנחם בגין להחזיר את כל סיני בתמורה להסכם שלום עם מצרים. בלי החלטה כזאת אנחנו בדרך לאסון.
Speaker after speaker said he must make some sacrifice over Jerusalem to avoid an eruption of violence. But Barak was well aware that to do so could be political suicide. They argued all day.
We're sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting. The president getting more and more angry and agitated about this, feeling that we're being treated like nobodies.
They asked me to do this, and then they don't want to talk, and they don't want me to bring them together. I mean, Arafat was only too happy to be brought together. But finally, Barak emerged late at night.
Barak arrived at Clinton's cabin with his offer. A couple of Palestinian villages on the outskirts of Jerusalem could become their capital.
ואמרתי לו, ההחלטה שלנו צריכה להיות איך אנחנו מוצאים דרך לשלב בין השאיפה שלנו לירושלים גדולה, רחבה, חזקה ויהודית יותר מאי פעם, לבין ההכרח להכיר בעובדות של שכונות פלסטיניות צפופות גדולות במזרח העיר. שום ראש ממשלה ישראלי לא יוותר לעולם על הריבונות בהר הבית.
So the president explodes and says, you made me wait here for 13 hours, and you come back with this? You go sell it to Arafat if you want to. Don't ask me to do it. I'm not going to do that.
הם מסתכלים ככה עין בעין. קלינטון אדום כזה. כי הנשיא האמריקאי הרגשתי שהוא בלחץ. אני הייתי שקט מאוד.
Well, I just told him, I said, you've got to go further. They've got to be able to see enough in your proposal to believe that if they give and you give and they give and you give, they'll get someplace they can live with. You've got to do better. You have got to do better.
Barak's opening gambit had failed. Was this the time for the arch-strategist to put all his chips on the table?
אני הגעתי אל ברק בחשאי כביכול, על אופניים, רכוב על האופניים, אל הכניסה האחורית לבקתה שלו. מצאתי אותו יושב מאחור, מסביבו פזורים עיתונים פתוחים, עיתונים, גם בעיקר עיתונים מהארץ. הוא עצמו לא מגולח, מאוד מהורהר, מאוד מכונס בעצמו. אמר לי, שמע, גילי, אני חייב פה להחליט ויתור על הריבונות בעיר העתיקה, הריבונות הישראלית הבלעדית בעיר העתיקה, אבל לקבל כנגד זה את סיום הסכסוך.
That evening, Barak was back at Clinton's cabin.
אמרתי לו, אני מוכן שאתה תעלה בפני ערפאת הצעה של חלוקת הרובעים.
בעצם הסתרר שקט בחדר של קלינטון. לכולם היה ברור לגמרי שברק עשה, הוא גם אמר זאת, הוא עשה ויתור ענק מבחינתו, הוא שבר כאן טאבו.
Barak had offered the Palestinians East Jerusalem as a capital. He had agreed to divide Jerusalem, something that all Israelis said they'd never do. And he offered them the Muslim and the Christian quarters in the old city.
The idea that half the old city would be under Arafat's sovereignty was completely unthinkable. We had gone to Camp David thinking the most we could get from the Israelis was 2 outer-lying suburbs.
ונושיט את היד כל כך רחוק, שאם היא לא תענה, נדע שמדובר בטרוריסט מהותי, ולא רק בטקטיקת טרור לצורך השגת הסכם מרחיק לכת.
The president called Arafat to his cabin.
Now he's mad too, because he's had to wait all day, and now it's the middle of the night, and nobody said anything to him. And from his point of view, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was invited to come, and we're all operating on the Israeli timetable from his point of view. So what's the deal? So anyway, he came. It was just him and me and Gamal, my interpreter.
The president turned to his interpreter to make the best possible case in Arabic to the Palestinian leader. But one part of the package would be hard to sell. When it came to Haram al-Sharif, the holy place in the old city that mattered most to Arafat, Barak still insisted that Israel retain sovereignty here. He offered Arafat only custodianship.
I tried to explain to him that this is a gain for the Palestinians. Jerusalem is not going to be lost. Haram is not going to be lost. I tried to explain it to him in different ways. The idea of a custodianship, when you look at Mecca, it's King Fahd is not the owner of the Aqsa Mosque. He's the custodian of the Aqsa Mosque.
There are some points which can, if you are in my place, you will not accept it.
I actually pleaded with him. I told him, Mr. Chairman, you've got to at least listen to this.
The rest of the team held their breath.
We were all huddled behind the door, and alternatively, one of us would go to the door and open it just a crack, peek through the window just a little bit so we could see what was going on. And what was going on was that Clinton was using the full range of the piano board on Arafat. Every key, every note. He was cajoling, he was persuading.
You know as well as I do that I wouldn't be proposing this if I didn't think the Israelis would take it. So you have to move and we have to stay. Otherwise, I'm going to Okinawa and we're quitting.
Said, you lose me, you lose my relationships will be over. What we have done, look, for the first time, I'm the president who brought you here. The Palestinian people are so close to their independence, to their own state. This will be finished. You will go back with nothing. Everything will be off the table. And it was a threat all along. What do you say? What do you say? Do you say, Mr. President, you're unfair?
I replied him in details about what can be done from our side, which will be accepted by the Arab nation and by the Christians and by the Muslims.
And Arafat, after being defensive a bit at first, takes the president's hand and says, "You're my only friend. I can't afford to lose you."
It was clear and obvious that they want to squeeze me.
Arafat was caught in a trap. Barak had offered him everything except the one thing he really wanted. He returned to his cabin to consult with his team.
وبدأ يحرك بساقه وهي حركة عصبية معروفة عنده وقال لي اسمع محمد لو أعطوني حلا مقبولا في القدس بإمكاني أن أكون مرنا في أشياء أخرى لا أستطيع أن أكون مرن في المصالح الإسلامية والعربية وإلا سأقتل.
The main issue was the holy sacred places.
ولكن الرئيس عرفات لم يعطيه إجابة بنعم أو لا ولكنه قال له أنا لا أريد أن أخون القدس وقال له هذه تبدو رفضا ولكن ليس بالطريقة المباشرة.
President Clinton had delayed his departure for Japan to try to change Arafat's mind, in vain. But neither side wanted to take the blame for failure.
Both sides said, "We'd like to stay. Will you ask us to stay while you're gone?" So I said, "Sure." And I got Chelsea, we left, and we went to Okinawa for the G8, my last G8 summit, and they stayed.
While Clinton spent the weekend with fellow world leaders in Japan, no progress was made in Camp David. When he returned to the talks, he found Barak still wouldn't yield sovereignty on the Temple Mount, or Haram, and Arafat wouldn't accept a settlement without it.
وكان الجو ماطرا وذهبنا سيرا على الأقدام. طبعا الرئيس كلينتون كان يدرك لحظة دخولنا أننا نحمل رفضا من شكلنا وطريقة دخولنا وطريقة أدائنا. هذه كانت لم تكن يعني.
The president sank back into his chair and he said, "You know, I don't like to fail, and especially at something like this."
Back home, in the Israeli parliament, Barak was branded a failure, even a traitor, for bargaining over Temple Mount. A formidable opponent set out to drive Barak from office.
One man, the prime minister, without discussing the issue with the inner cabinet, without bringing it to the government, without bringing it to the Knesset, without asking any one of the Jewish leaders around the world, decided to hand over the holiest place of the Jewish people. I would say it's something that no one can understand.
To make his point that Temple Mount belonged to the Jews, Ariel Sharon said he would take a public walk on Haram al-Sharif, around two of Islam's holiest mosques.
ועליתי לא פעם להר הבית, זה היה ערב חג או קרוב לחגים, והרגשתי שאני צריך לבקר בהר הבית.
הוא רצה להראות לאזרחי המדינה שבניגוד לברק, שעל פי השמועות שהוא ניסה להפיץ ויתר על הר הבית, הוא המגן של זכויותינו. עכשיו, איך הוא יכול לזכויותינו? הוא יכול רק לממש את הזכות החוקית הנתונה לכל אחד, לעשות שם סיור על הרחבה. ולכן מבחינתי לא היה איזה עניין מיוחד להיראות כמי שמונע ממנו הפגנה פוליטית נגדי.
Still seeking a peace deal, the Israeli Prime Minister finally agreed to a face-to-face meeting with Arafat. A dinner was arranged at Barak's home.
And then Mrs. Barak came. He says, Nova, so stood up, all of us. Of course, she came to shake hands with Mr. Arafat. He kissed her hand.
ערפאת היה מאוד מנומס, יש לו לפעמים, יש לו נימוסים של השלחתה הפולנית, כזה מנשק את הידיים ודברים מהסוג הזה.
And she said, I prepared very good chicken for you. I said, I'm glad it's not fish because I'm allergic to seafood, which is true.
אמרתי, אתה מוכרח, אתה פשוט מוכרח לקחת אותו ולדבר איתו. ואהוד אמר, מה אני אעשה עם כל היתר? אמרתי לו, היתר עלינו.
Barak and President Arafat were almost whispering to each other because I was sitting next to President Arafat to help him in the translation sometimes. And then all of a sudden they both stand up and say, we're going to go outside. There was a veranda outside. They opened the glass gate and then they shut the glass gate behind them.
היינו נרגשים כאילו במין שידוך שאוטוטוטוטו מצליח. שיש דיבור.
Barak and Arafat returned indoors full of confidence, telling their negotiators the goodwill they had established could now overcome the remaining obstacles to peace.
צאו לדרך, אתם אינשאללה תגמרו את מה שעוד ניתן לגמור, בעוד שבוע אנחנו מגיעים וחותמים על ההסכם.
He looked at Mr. Barak and said, let them go, I'm sure we will make it, but please, 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 Your Excellency, don't allow Sharon to come to Haram.
Hanging over the whole room was the threat of Ariel Sharon's visit to the mosques on Haram Temple Mount, scheduled to occur in 3 days.
I remember President Arafat telling Mr. Barak, he wants to destroy everything. Your Excellency, if he goes to Haram, he will be the only person laughing in the next months to come.
You had to put in your consideration that this visit will make a big story, not only with us, with all the Muslims all over the world.
תראה, אדוני הצ'רמן, החוק מאפשר לאנשים לבקר על הר הבית, גם לחברי כנסת ישראלים. מותר לבקר שם, זה לא שטח סגור.
Barak took no action. Just after dawn, Sharon entered the mosque enclave above Temple Mount. With him came hundreds of police and security staff.
אני באתי לשם, כמו תמיד התרגשתי לבקר בהר הבית. לא ראיתי בזה שום דבר, אין לזה שום קשר לפתיחת האינתיפאדה. נושא האינתיפאדה, הרש של האינתיפאדה התחילה קודם.
I came here with a message of peace. I believe that we can live together with the Palestinians. I came here to the holiest place of the Jewish people in order to see what happens here.
What happened here that Thursday was that a crowd of outraged Palestinians rushed the security cordon and tried to stone Ariel Sharon.
كنت بعيد عنه حوالي يمكن 5 متر. نعم، وفي عدد كبير كان من يعني حاولنا بصراحة، يعني حاولنا احنا انه نهجم عليه، رغم انه ما تمكناش لانه في معه كتافي كان بشكل غريب، يعني حراسة مشددة جدا، فما تمكناش. ضلينا نصرخ ونطلب يعني مغادرته من هذا المكان، مغادرة المسجد الأقصى. يا شرون، يعني اشياء، شايف كيف نحاول انه يا شرون هذا المكان مش إلك، يا شرون هذا استفزاز.
לא פגענו שם בשום נושא ולא הייתה גם שום כוונה כזאת. עליתי להר הבית, המקום הקדוש ביותר לעם היהודי.
The next day, after Friday prayers, Israeli police fired on Palestinian protesters, killing 7. With these casualties began the most violent phase yet of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Al-Aqsa Intifada. As the violence spread across the occupied territories, it looked as though the peace process was doomed. But President Clinton was determined that it could be rescued. He turned to his Secretary of State.
It was, we felt, important to try to get Prime Minister Barak and Chairman Arafat together. I had some meetings in Paris with the French Foreign Minister Vidrine.
Madeleine voulait à tout prix obtenir quelque chose, si possible avant les élections de novembre, mais en tout cas avant que Bill Clinton quitte la Maison-Blanche.
For the sake of speed, the Secretary summoned Barak and Arafat to discuss a ceasefire. But the venue had a problem.
There was a risk in having it in France, because the question was, what was the French role?
The French president, Jacques Chirac, was in no doubt about how the Intifada had started.
Une provocation irresponsable sur le lieu saint de l'esplanade des mosquées.
Our problem was that we literally did not want Chirac to get involved in this.
To Mrs. Albright's dismay, when the Palestinian leader arrived in Paris, his first call was on the French president. Barak had to follow suit, although the Israelis believed that Chirac was on the side of the Palestinians.
Barak n'était pas très content d'être obligé de venir à Paris, mais il avait besoin de Clinton, donc de Madeleine. Madeleine avait insisté, et donc il est venu.
The protagonists assembled at the residence of the US ambassador to France, American territory for an American-sponsored ceasefire.
The meeting really could not get started. There was a lot of fireworks between President Arafat and Barak. That animosity was very clear. And there was very little that we could move on.
פעם אחר פעם ברק אומר לערפאת, אתה מוכרח להורות לאנשים שלך להפסיק. עד שלא תעשה את זה, זה לא יקרה.
אמרתי לו, מיסטר צ'רמן, אולי אתה תרים עכשיו טלפון למרואן ברגותי ולחסן אל-שייח, ותודיע להם פה בנוכחותנו שאתה מורה להם להפסיק. ערפאת מסתכל עליי ואומר, הוא, בהבעה של אחד ששמע שמות של שני דובי קוטב. אז אני אומר לו, בהתאמה במבטא ערבי, מרואן ברותי. והוא מנסה לעשות עוד פעם דבר הזה, אבל האנשים שלו כבר מאחוריו לא יכולים להתאפק, והם פורצים בצחוק, כי ברור להם שהוא יודע, שאני יודע, שהוא יודע, שזה שני אנשים שמטעמו מארגנים את המהומות שם. ואז הוא עשה, כן.
As the session degenerated into point scoring, Mrs. Albright decided to talk to each leader separately.
She asked to be with Mr. Barak alone. And President Arafat stayed in the middle, looking at the paintings, looking at things, and then the minutes passed.
And I go to see Arafat just to sort of, and talk to him while this is going on. And he looks at me and he says, "You think I don't know what's happening?" And his voice is rising. "You think I don't know what's happening? I know why I'm waiting. I know that you're on the phone and Barak is on the phone with Chirac to try to turn him against me. And I'm not going to go for this."
You expect that she finishes with Barak in a minute, in 2, in 3, in 4, did not 5, 10, and then...
He just bolted out of the meeting, left running through the stairs into his car. And Mrs. Albright just ran after him.
There is a cobblestone courtyard with big wooden gates at the end. And I'm running because Arafat is about to get into his car, and I'm running over this in my high heels, and I keep yelling, "Shut the gates! Shut the gates!"
"President Arafat," she called. "President Arafat," she yelled.
And then she ran towards the car and she started banging in the window of the president.
I said, "Look, Mr. Chairman, we have come so far. We have gotten agreement on a lot of points. Please come back in."
He kissed her hand and then they walked back in and then they reconciled in the way and then...
And we have very important discussions, and we arrived to very important platform.
The platform Arafat wanted raised was who was to blame for the latest outbreak of violence.
What Chairman Arafat wanted was an international commission to investigate the facts of what had really happened in terms of the way that the Intifada had started, who hit whom.
And the Israeli position was absolutely not. We're not going to internationalize this. We don't want the UN or anyone else involved.
By 11 that night, it was agreed the detail of the inquiry would be settled later. They were on the brink of a ceasefire agreement that could save Clinton's peace effort.
All of a sudden, I get a phone call from President Chirac, and he says, I think that, you are in my country and protocol is very important, and I need to host you and the Prime Minister and President Arafat. And I said, "Mr. President," in French, "this is a very important moment. This is not a really good idea for us to come right now. We're about to finalize on this document."
President Arafat said, "We have to go. We have an invitation. He's the host."
When they arrived at the Elysee, President Chirac's whispered welcome only added to Secretary Albright's forebodings. But then she discovered that instead of the social occasion she was expecting, Chirac had had a table set up for a formal conference, including the UN Secretary General, who'd been summoned from dinner with the French Foreign Minister.
Dès qu'Yasser Arafat prend la parole, il veut cette commission d'enquête, c'est pour lui un point fondamental. Et Barak refuse. Donc le président de la République, au nom du pays qui exerçait la présidence, a parlé de la commission d'enquête, mais pas comme condition préalable.
ואולברט אומרת לו, "סליחה אדוני הנשיא, הנושא הזה ירד מסדר היום. אני אומר לך שיש נייר מוסכם."
I was very angry at Chirac, that's for sure. And I remember just kind of giving him the dirtiest look, thinking, you know, you broke an agreement here. This was not what this was going to be about.
Monsieur le Président, s'il vous plaît. Est-ce qu'on peut avoir une photo, s'il vous plaît? Monsieur le Président.
Worse was to come for the Secretary of State.
Sir. S'il vous plaît. S'il vous plaît.
Instead of returning to the talks, Arafat set off for his hotel, leaving Albright stranded.
Mrs. Albright said, you promised me that you were going to stay.
So I ran after him, I opened the car door and I said, Mr. Chairman, you still have to initial the agreement. Please, you gave your word.
And he said, I am delivering my promise. I am leaving Nabil Shaat, my foreign minister, and so let it continue on foreign minister's level, and I will be in my hotel, and you can call me anytime.
There, we couldn't close any gates. We were at the Elysee, so basically he got into his car. He instructed the driver to go, and he said, go, and he left.
Arafat had escaped the attempt to pin him down to a ceasefire agreement without a full-blown inquiry. The Intifada continued. In the 10 weeks until Christmas, 268 Palestinians and 30 Israelis were killed. But President Clinton kept trying.
Merry Christmas, and let's light the tree. Thank you very much.
A month before he left the White House for good, Clinton summoned the Israeli and Palestinian negotiating teams one last time.
ונכנס קלינטון באיחור של דקה או שתיים, אני חושב, הוא נכנס כולו casual לגמרי, עם איזשהו פולו כזה אדום ומכנסי ג'ינס.
He was grim. I've never seen him so grim, like angry.
The text Clinton read out gave the Palestinians a state with a capital in East Jerusalem, and at last, sovereignty over Haram al-Sharif. But Israel kept the whole Western and Wailing Wall and what lay buried behind it.
I said, these are my parameters. I've been listening for months. We've been working for months. This is the best I can do.
If you accept them, you accept them. If you don't, they leave office when I do.
קם, אמר God bless you, ויצא מהחדר.
The Israeli cabinet soon accepted the Clinton parameters, as long as the Palestinians would as well. But secretly, they would hand over a long list of reservations. Arafat, too, was asking for clarifications. Clinton summoned him to the White House and demanded a final answer.
Arafat says, he says some good words. He says, I accept these in principle. But as is the case with Barak, I am sure, there's some issues I have reservations with, and as in any negotiation, Barak and I should be able to talk about them.
Arafat's reservations centered on the compromise Clinton had devised for the Haram Temple Mount.
So I proposed that the Palestinians have sovereignty over the top of the Temple Mount, and the Israelis have sovereignty over the Western Wall and the holy space of which it was a part, which would give them, in effect, the bottom of the Temple Mount where the ruins of the temples of Solomon and Herod were.
They have the sovereignty after, under the Haram Sharif, and we have the control over the Haram Sharif. Who can accept this?
And the president was extraordinarily disappointed. And he said to Chairman Arafat, you know, they've always told me that you are someone who will wait till 5 minutes of 12, but I'm afraid your watch is broken, Mr. Chairman.
Clinton had gambled that an unequivocal yes from Arafat might just pull it off. The president hadn't told Arafat, but Barak, who had elections coming up within weeks, had phoned the day before with a bombshell.
אני אמרתי לו, תראה, אני לא רוצה להיכנס לשאלה אם הפרמטרים האלה מתאימים או לא מתאימים להיות סיום. אנחנו כמו שהם לא יכולים לקבל אותם.
Barak, because Arafat had not accepted them, was under enormous political pressure. So he needed some maneuvering room to look like he was backing off of them too. And I understood that.
Neither side accepted Clinton's parameters. A historic opportunity had been lost. Two weeks later, Clinton handed over the reins to the new US president with some words of advice. George W. Bush, determined to learn from his predecessor's experience, made it clear he had no immediate plans for Middle East peacemaking. Back in the occupied territories, Arafat remained a hero to his people.
القدس هي عاصمة دولة فلسطين، شاء من شاء وأبى من أبى، واللي مش عاجبه يشرب من بحر غزة.
But despite the cheering, the Palestinians were no closer to a state of their own.